Hello, in this video, I'll be describing research that I've conducted within the past calendar year, describing American state legislators in 9 states and their reaction to the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, particularly as it relates to sexual assault allegations regarding Brett Kavanaugh during the confirmation process. This research was presented at the 2019 International Social Media and Society Conference in Toronto, Canada, when I visited there in the summer. So let's nail down some elements of the timeline. This is a period that occurs from July 9th to October 7th of 2018. On July 9th, the Kavanaugh nomination was announced, and then there was a first round of hearings, but it was on September 12th that the first news of a sexual assault accusation regarding Brett Kavanaugh was announced. And then over the next 2 weeks, that information spread to the point where on September 27th, there was a single day in which, you may recall, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who told the world that she had been sexually assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh, and then Brett Kavanaugh himself testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Brett Kavanaugh was then confirmed on a very contentious vote and was sworn into the Supreme Court, where he sits as one of the 9 justices of the United States Supreme Court today. So, it's fairly safe to say that most individuals who were aware of the Kavanaugh nomination and the messages of Christine Blasey Ford and her supporters regarding sexual assault by Brett Kavanaugh have positions regarding this. These were highly salient communications. They were all over the airwaves, the newspapers, social media, Twitter, Facebook, and people took positions. You most likely, if you're aware of these events, and most people in the United States you most likely have a position. I don't want to discuss the specific positions and evaluate them in terms of which positions are right and which positions are wrong, but instead, in the research that I'm conducting, I'm asking what motivates those positions? How are those positions distributed? And given that there are 2 highly salient social forces that were invoked here, how do those positions fall down or are distributed according to those social forces? The forces of gender and the forces of political party. This is happening in a political environment, but they are very gendered claims. So, to quote a pair of newspaper articles that are cited at the end of this lecture, there are some claims that position was organized according to gender. So listen to this one claim. Many women said, quote, Ford's experiences echoed their own, and they, meaning women, were appalled at Kavanaugh's anger. And, on the other hand, many men saw his indignation during the hearing Thursday as justified, a reflection of the gender divide stoked by the nomination. So that's a claim by Rohr that the hearings and the allegations led to a split in position according to gender. But there are other journalists who were writing at the time of the Kavanaugh nomination who are describing something different. So David Brady, again, last year in 2018, is saying support for Kavanaugh was already divided along party lines, Democrats and Republicans when the allegations became public. Kavanaugh was nominated by a Republican and was voted in largely on a Republican Party line. Since then, he continues, partisans have become even more deeply entrenched in their beliefs. So Brady is claiming that the division is one of party. Rohr is claiming that the division is one of gender. And is one true and the other false? Can both be true? Can both be false? Well, let's consider that. One place we might look to for a consideration is public opinion polling. And so we could look at the Quinnipiac poll, which was conducted on September 27th to 30th, right after those hearings, that day of hearings. And there were two questions. Do you think the US Supreme Court should confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court or not? And which do you tend to believe most? The accusation of sexual assault made by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, or do you believe the denial made by Judge Brett Kavanaugh? And so here we're seeing percentages vertically of responses where we have four categories: Republicans and Democrats, and then men and women. So for the first question, do you think the U.S. Senate, should confirm Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court or not? Notice that huge majorities of Republicans believe that he should be confirmed. Huge majorities of Democrats report believing that he should not be confirmed. And the same is occurring regarding sexual assault allegations. Huge majorities of Republicans report believing Kavanaugh, that's blue, and huge shares, this is all over 80%, it's almost exactly the same pattern, report believing Christine Blasey Ford. So the interesting thing about gender and party is that although there are patterns of gender according to different political parties, that is, Republicans are more likely to be men than women, and Democrats are more likely to be women than men, there are Republican women, a significant share of Republicans are women, and a significant share of Democrats are men. So when we look at just men and women in these same responses, what's interesting is that although more men than women proportionally indicate in this poll support for Brett Kavanaugh, and although more men and women indicate support for Kavanaugh than for Ford, more women indicate opposition to the nomination and support for Christine Blasey Ford. The margins are not the same as those by party. They're a lot closer. So there's a lot of variation here by gender. Much more variation than there is according to party, where the shares of Republicans supporting Christine Blasey Ford, her accusation, and opposing Brett Kavanaugh's nomination are below 10%. And the converse is true for Democrats. Opposition to the claims of Christine Blasey Ford and support for Brett Kavanaugh is below 10%. So, unfortunately, the Quinnipiac poll did not release what would be intersectional data. That is, indications of what Republican men believe, what Republican women believe, what Democratic men believe, and what Democratic women believe. Instead, they just present Republicans and Democrats and men and women, not the combination. So for that one reason, there's a good reason to look at another source. Also, the public here is not the only player here. In fact, the public didn't actually get to vote. They got to exert some pressure. But, politicians are people too, but the politicians here are not normal people. The members of the Senate are those that are actually voting on this, but there are many more politicians in the United States who are talking about this issue. Do the politicians, on the one hand, behave in this pattern? And what about the combinations of Republican men, Republican women, Democratic men, and Democratic women? Are they responding to different forces? And what about those politicians who are watching from the sidelines just as well? What are they going to do? In order to figure this out, I tracked all the communications made by all the state legislators in 9 states. And I also drew then on theory about what it is that makes politicians different. Why do politicians do what they do? Is it just what people do, or is it different? And Margaret Scamell in 1995, in a book, Designer Politics, How Elections Are Won, really encapsulated the disagreement among political scientists about what motivates politicians. On the one hand is the political communications as conviction model. And that says politicians just, they say what they feel, they express what they think, they have convictions, and then they express those convictions. The second idea is that political communication is a matter of marketing. That is, politicians don't necessarily say what they believe. They are signaling positions to get themselves voters' approval and thereby to get themselves votes. So that you can't necessarily take a politician at their word. What they're engaging in is highly processed, careful, not necessarily sincere communication. Two very different claims, two very different theories of political communication. But this is not just communication, it's a question of representation, right? So Hannah Pitkin, in her political research, oh goodness, now this is over 50 years ago, she wrote a book. It was called The Concept of Representation, and she made this classic distinction between two types of representation that could happen in political systems. So let's think about this in terms of gender. Let's think about this in terms of men and women. How could men be represented in politics? How could women be represented in politics? Well, Hannah Pitkin says there are two ways this could happen. The first is descriptive representation. Now, the claim of descriptive representation is that, let's say, men will be represented in politics to the extent that there are men, people that look like the men that are being represented in the political bodies. And women will be represented to the extent that there are women in politics. The assumption behind this is that people behave according to the category that they are placed in, right? That there is something about the experience, the life experience, and perspective of being a woman or being a man that leads to particular behavior. And that political communication, there's a bit of an assumption here, is a bit of a conviction that politicians will express what they feel, express what they see, express what they perceive, and that will be based on life experience. So if you want men to be represented in politics, you put men there. If you want women to be represented in politics, you put women there in the political bodies as representatives. A very different claim about political representation in politics is the theory that Pitkin identified of substantive representation. That is, that representation doesn't happen by category, it happens by deed. And so a political representative of men, assuming that there are men's interests distinctively in politics, would be engaged in to the extent that a representative, no matter what they look like, no matter what their gender might be, their gender identity, substantive representation of men would happen, and men's interests would occur when there would be people who speak men's interests, whether that person speaking is a man or a woman. And according to the idea of substantive representation, that kind of interest can occur no matter what the body of the representative is. So feminists would represent feminism, misogynists would represent misogyny, There can be men who are feminists. There can be women who are misogynists. Um, this is also a claim made by Bell Hooks. And therefore, it's not only not enough if you're a believer in substantive representation to say that you need women in a political body in order for women's interests to be represented. It actually may not be the main thing you want to have happen if your only interest is that women's interests will be pursued. Instead, what you want is people who believe in women's interests, uphold women's interests, regardless of what their bodies are, or regardless of that sex, regardless of what their social identity is, and that's gender. So there are all kinds of reasons that representation might happen. It could happen because voters might be feminists and pressure someone. It might happen because a person might culturally come to ascribe to a certain set of beliefs, regardless of what their personal identity is. Very different claims about why politicians do what they do. So I wanted to think about that. We know the gender identity, um, and we know the political affiliation of state legislators. Um, so we can then look at what legislators actually say, what their communication behavior is, how they discuss this salient political moment, the Kavanaugh nomination. And I looked at this in 9 states. I looked at it on the social media platform Twitter. Why social media? Because it's trackable and it's recorded, right? So, and it's exhaustively recorded. It's on Twitter, particularly public, so that these are public pronouncements of politicians where all their representatives can see them. Why state legislators? Well, they're really interesting folks. First of all, there are a lot of them, so we can look at a large data set, a large number of cases. The second thing that we can do with state legislators is look at politicians as they're moving up the political ladder. Now, they're not entirely disenfranchised like members of the public. They have some say over what their party does, but many state legislators are hoping to move up into the United States Congress. It's kind of like the junior leagues of baseball, right? And so what they do matters, what they say matters, but they aren't entirely constrained, as the United States Senate is, to vote. So they're freed up in that way, a little bit more free than the United States Senate, a little bit less free than the public, a little bit more power than the public, a little bit, quite a bit less power than the United States Senate. Let's see what they talk about. Um, so I had 3 questions. Were patterns of support and opposition to the Kavanaugh nomination associated with gender or party or both? Second, did legislators change their positions as new information was introduced, which happened across that whole period um, during the Kavanaugh nomination from July to October? Or were those legislators' positions fixed across time? Because we can track the date of Twitter posts. Third, across lines of gender and party, um, it's not just what the patterns of support and oppositions were. That's not the only variation. There's also the question of, do people talk at all or do they stay silent? Are state legislators talking about the Kavanaugh nomination, or are they keeping their mouths closed? Who talks? Uh, what do they talk about? And do they change their minds? So, one of the things you might be thinking at this point is that that answer is obvious to you. I'd like to argue that the answer is not obvious. First of all, we had those claims by those 2 journalists at the beginning about what's really driving the Kavanaugh nomination, right? And they were different. So it's clearly there's a distinction there. In public opinion polling, there were different amounts of power to explain a variation for gender and party. although both seem to have some kind of thing going on. The public, however, is not the same as state legislators. And finally, state legislators themselves don't agree. So Representative Daniel Hernandez of Arizona is saying honest proposal, and there's an implied colon here, no more old men chairing Senate Judiciary. And then there's the hashtag Kavanaugh hearings to let you know this is about the Kavanaugh hearings, in case you were wondering. So what Daniel Hernandez is saying is that the problem is that there are these old men chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee for and leading the Kavanaugh hearings, right? That is a claim of descriptive representation, right? That by having old men chairing the committee and therefore the hearing regarding the sexual assault allegations by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford against Brett Kavanaugh, that there's a certain outcome that's going to happen, and that needs to be rectified. On the other hand, another state legislator, Dick Brubaker, is saying, yeah, so what else is new? He's replying to a couple of other people. Oh, and it's referring to a member of the United States Senate and saying of that senator, oh, he's been a no from the beginning, and this process has become so partisan, I'm not even sure it matters who the nominee is. Dick Brubaker is claiming, oh, what really matters is political party, right? And here's this man who's going to vote no, and it's just a partisan thing. Party is driving it. These two state legislators disagree. The answer doesn't seem obvious if we take state legislators at their word. So, what I did was to take advantage of an opportunity in my research method. I had been collecting lists and curating lists of Twitter accounts of state legislators. And I'd done so for 21 states when all of a sudden the Kavanaugh nomination occurred and this research opportunity presented itself. At this point in time, I have gone through the data for 9 out of those 28 states. So the states that are blue are ones that unfortunately I wasn't able to get data for. The states that I have collected data for are in either yellow or green. And the yellow states are those that are forming the analysis that I'm presenting today. I'm hoping as soon as I get done grading exams and all the other work that I have to finish work for the other 12 states, and we'll see what is said there. I had to stop, unfortunately, in collecting data and wasn't able to get all 50 states because as election day happened in 2018 and some of these legislators lost, some of them started to delete their Twitter accounts. And so I was not, unfortunately, able to collect all the Twitter data for all the state legislators of all the 50 states. And some of that data is just lost forever, these blue states. But I did get it for 21 states, and as you can see, they are spread across the country in many different regions, some of them Democratic controlled, some of them Republican controlled. So I used the statistical package R to grab these tweets and also to engage in some analysis of them. Let's take a look at the 9 states I'm presenting about today: Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida. As you can tell, I was collecting that information alphabetically. So I'm very sorry about Wyoming, but I won't be collecting that data. There are many legislators in each state, right? What is true, by the way, for all these states is that there were in the 2017-2018 sessions of the state legislatures for these 9 states, no state legislators who were openly transgender. Every state legislator either identified as a man or a woman and used feminine or masculine pronouns accordingly. The first column shows how many tweets that there were during the period of the nomination. What's the percentage that occur on Kavanaugh? You can read down through those. You can see that although Alaska doesn't have that many tweets, even though it has a reasonable number of legislators, almost 10% of them are about the Kavanaugh nomination. That's really highly salient. On the other hand, California has its legislators, of which there are just only about twice as many as there are in Alaska. They have many, 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 many more tweets. The California state legislators use Twitter a lot, and only 2% of the tweets are about the Kavanaugh nomination. So that although there are more tweets about the Kavanaugh nomination in California, it represents a smaller share. Now, of all those legislators, going to the next column, there's a certain number that are on Twitter. Not every state legislator has a Twitter account. Furthermore, fewer of them still were actually using Twitter during the period of July to October of 2018. And of those, only some issued Twitter posts, what are called tweets, about the Kavanaugh issue during that time. So this is a set of variations, right? So these are variables. And sometimes the answers to research questions don't require complicated statistics. So if you recall the first question, were patterns of support and opposition to the Kavanaugh nomination associated with gender or party or both? The answer is one way and only one way, without any exceptions at all, across all these thousands and thousands of tweets, right? Even just on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh, there were thousands of them. Those tweeting Kavanaugh support, without any exception, were Republican state legislators, and those tweeting Kavanaugh opposition were Democrats. No exception. This question is entirely answered by it being a matter of political party. Again, for research question 2, did state legislators change their mind? No statistical model is necessary. I don't have to run a multiple regression. I don't have to show you a correlation coefficient or p-values of statistical significance, because there are no exceptions. There are no state legislators that changed their position of support or opposition regarding the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh over time. This is an indication, if we go back to these theories, that politics is a matter of signaling to get voters, because there's consistent messaging over time. We know that people do change their minds over time, but these politicians don't. And second, that political party is predicting what the position is that people take, something that doesn't change over time, not the state legislators' gender identity. So this seems to be a matter of substantive representation, not descriptive representation. Having women in politics is not enough, right? Because there are men who are expressing opposition, women who are expressing support for Kavanaugh, and it goes down very neat party lines. And by neat, I don't mean good or bad, I just mean very tidy, no exceptions at all. These two research questions are answered very quickly and cleanly. What about, though, the matter of talking about the Kavanaugh nomination or not? Here's where we need to start talking about logistic regressions. You use logistic regressions to predict a dichotomous dependent variable, or do you speak about the Kavanaugh nomination on Twitter? Yes or no. So what I did here was to take all state legislators who were active on Twitter posting about something during the nomination period of July to October 2018. The question is, if they're posting about something, they're using Twitter. There's a lot of talk about Kavanaugh out there. Are they talking about Kavanaugh? So it turns out here that both party and gender matter, and that the effect is intersectional, to use a phrase that we've talked about in class before. So on the right-hand side, there's slopes. They are negative if the category over on the left, on the same row, leads one to be less likely to post a tweet about Kavanaugh. It's positive if that category makes you more likely to post about Kavanaugh. Okay? And so what we see here is that Republicans are less likely than Democrats to open their mouths about the Kavanaugh nomination. That women are more likely than men to post about the Kavanaugh nomination. Okay, so those two columns are pretty straightforward. So men are overall more silent than women about the Kavanaugh nomination on Twitter. Republicans are more silent than Democrats about the Kavanaugh nomination. But this is intersectional. So that's true in general. But if you're a Republican woman, take a look at that effect, right? It's a negative effect. It outweighs the positive effect of being a woman on saying something. So that Republican women particularly are likely to keep their mouths closed or keep their fingers off the keyboard when it comes to the subject of the Kavanaugh nomination. The converse, Democratic women are the ones that are more likely to speak. So what this means is that for Republican women, there's this saying that's out there in our culture, which is if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. Perhaps they have something not nice to say about the Kavanaugh nomination. But in order to respond to political pressure, social pressure, something else, what? We don't know. You can't prove why it is that someone's quiet. Republican women are not talking about this issue. Republicans in general are less likely than Democrats to speak. And women are more likely unless they're Republican women. So Democratic women are especially likely to speak about the issue. And how much tweeting? The same pattern happens. Okay, so Republicans are, if they talk about Kavanaugh, are talking about it less, a negative slope. Women, if they talk about the Kavanaugh nomination, are talking about it more. They're putting out more tweets. And Republican women, those who do tweet about Kavanaugh at least once, are especially likely to do so only once, to not talk about it very much. So finally, how are those positions expressed? Okay, so of the 229 state legislators tweeting about Kavanaugh, you can do more than talk about what you think the vote should be. You can talk about the political process. However, it looks like any concern about how the process is going matches overall, with 3 exceptions, what your position is. That is, you tend to support the political process that benefits your position. If you oppose Kavanaugh, you have a problem with the political process carried out by those who have the other position, and vice versa, with 3 exceptions. David Meeks of Arkansas, Matt Gray of Colorado, and Jared Moskowitz of Florida critiqued their own side. So these are 2 retweets by them. A Republican state legislator is retweeting a tweet by Winnie Wright, who is criticizing Donald Trump's tweet about the allegations by Christine Blasey Ford. Donald Trump had said, hey, if those allegations were so bad, then as a teenager, she would have filed charges immediately. We know it. I can tell you as a sociologist, we know that that's not how it works when you write is correct. And a Republican state legislator retweets that, indicating support for criticism of the president on that point, even though that legislator otherwise supported the Kavanaugh nomination. And Beto O'Rourke, who is a Democratic former member of Congress, was putting a tweet out there that said, it's not right that Senator Ted Cruz was surrounded by a bunch of anti-Kavanaugh protesters and heckled while he was having dinner with his wife, Heidi Cruz. And there was a Democratic state legislator who retweeted that. Otherwise, though, that's an exception. In 226 out of 229 state legislators, process on their own side was not criticized, only the process on the other side. Finally, we can take a look at how these positions were expressed. If you're going to show support for Kavanaugh or opposition to Kavanaugh, how do you do it? Well, the first thing you could do is that you can support your person. The second is that you can criticize the other person, either Kavanaugh or Ford, depending on your position. The third thing you can do is not talk about the person, but you can evaluate the allegations, right? And say the allegations are right or the allegations are wrong. That's very different than evaluating the person. And finally, you can critique the process. And in terms of what the politicians do here on Twitter, it's very different depending on if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Republicans, shown in red, are much more likely to tweet out support for Kavanaugh and quite unlikely to tweet out a critique of Christine Blasey Ford. Democrats, on the other hand, while they are somewhat inclined to critique Brett Kavanaugh, spend much more time tweeting out support for they do. I misstated that. Although they do support Christine Blasey Ford to some extent and tweet that out, they are much more likely to critique their opponent, talking negatively about Kavanaugh. Democrats are much more likely to put out an evaluation of the allegations, whereas Republicans are not. Both of them are really happy to talk about the process, and talking about the political process is a little bit safer, and so they do. So these are some references that are going to be also posted at the end of the text lecture. But notice that by thinking about the acts of political communication by state legislators that are out there, we're able to, by looking at the patterns of who says what, who doesn't say what, and how they change over time, we're actually able to simultaneously think about what is the role of gender in politics and what is the role of representation in politics. Does having a man or a woman in a seat guarantee what they do, what they say, how they behave? The answer seems to be no. That just as Bell Hooks said, misogyny isn't just something carried out by men, it is also something that can be supported by women, and that feminists are not just people who are women, but who have a particular position regarding women being themselves in the social roles of identified as a man or a woman. Either way, that seems to be the supported pattern we have with the Kavanaugh nomination.